Sorry.
All right. Sorry about that. So yeah, I mean, value of tourism. Really, so when we gave this presentation in BC a couple months ago now, we were having a collaborative session. We're going to try to do the same. So feel free to add some comments into the comments section of the presentation. But why is it important to your community? There's a couple of reasons why it might be. So I'll talk unless there's some comments that come in. But in tourism Kamloops, which was at the time supported by an MRDT tax and continues to be, ensuring that there was support for that tax was an important objective. But it wasn't the only objective. It was really building, that community of stakeholders and champions was critically important. I know I've been talking to several tourism DMOs and tourism people as of late. And I know that in some cases, municipal funding support is going away. So, I mean, that's obviously a critical thing for DMOs in terms of how they're going to support themselves going forward. I know we just saw the province of Alberta just made an announcement today about withholding some tourism levies and letting operators hold on to those for a little bit longer, which obviously makes a lot of sense, but has an impact on DMOs. It did say in that announcement, coincidentally, that there's going to be some additional support coming, but we'll see what that looks like. So there's all kinds of reasons why a value of tourism project is important for your community. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why you probably wanted to consider it before, but I would suggest there's probably extra reasons now to what I was calling at the time, double down on your hometown. So feel free to use that as a hashtag. So really, I mean, double down on your hometown. You know what? Your locals are so critical to your success now. It's actually never been more important to understand how your locals are feeling and what it's going to take for them to feel comfortable inviting guests back into your community. So, those are all just a few of the reasons why the value of tourism is an important thing right now.
If you guys have been showcasing value of tourism in your community, just throw a comment in the chat box. I mean, even some of you operators that are on the line, I'd love to hear, like, if you're polling already, if you do kind of the annual news release, Joanne, so Cochrane strategic plan, local feedback, 93% of supportive of tourism. I think, as Peter talks about right now, it being so important, and I think about the round table that's coming up in just half an hour with the Alberta government. They need to hear these numbers, right? So as they talk to the tourism folks in the province and same with BC and across the country, what a powerful statistic. Hey, you got 93% of people supporting tourism in Cochrane. Very cool.
And just coincidentally, we have been talking to some DMOs and we'll be doing some polling in local communities in the coming weeks. It'll be super interesting to understand in those communities how things have changed. One of the communities we did polling about a year ago. So it's going to be just incredibly important for that community to understand how things have changed. And really what it's going to take for people to be comfortable with tourists coming back into their locations.
Totally. All right. So, I mean, this is just, I feel like we can breeze by this, but just remembering that value of tourism is about locals, right? I think as DMOs, and like I said before, as operators, you're so focused externally that sometimes it's like, well, what are we doing? I remember drawing on the whiteboard at Tourism Kamloops, and Michelle will remember this, and, drawing umbrellas and going, okay, this is value of tourism, this is how Love in the Loops fits in, but, grab your felt and your whiteboard, because value of tourism is different than what a tourism marketing organization has typically done. I stole your slide.
It's okay.
Things you're allowed to do when your husband's your co-presenter.
All right. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, really Christine and I based really our approach and our strategies based on our political backgrounds. And really these 6 steps that we're introducing to you today are really the 6 steps on how to create a successful political campaign. And the principles apply exactly to a value of tourism or local advocacy program, despite the fact that there may or may not be as political. That just depends on your community, I guess.
All right. Okay, number one was make no assumptions. So, you know, how do you do that? You have conversations. I think that the conversations we initially had back in 2016 really opened our eyes to who was supportive and who wasn't. And I think there were some surprising voices around some of the roundtables we hosted that we went, oh, we didn't realize how much you were affected by this DMO. Or, oh, there's all these really interesting stakeholders that want to tell their stories. I think sometimes we run into this, you know, we're using the same people over and over again to tell the same stories, and all these interesting businesses started to come out of the woodwork. Polling, again, like we said, became this really powerful tool. All of this too created almost this really safe space for Tourism Kamloops to start being a leader in these conversations, right? So I think back to some of the other things that have happened over the last couple of years, fires in particular. Tourism Kamloops began to become a leader in the conversation around what was happening in the overall community. And again, now that we're into COVID and this particular piece, it really gave them the opportunity to lead this YK Strong initiative because of those relationships.
And I'm going to make up a couple statistics for you right now, because I think they pretty much apply to anything, but they're made up, so just keep that in mind. But on any issue, doesn't matter what it is, there's 5% of people on one side who are extremely loud, and 5% of people on the other side who are extremely loud. And then there's about 90% of the people in the middle who really don't say much. And often I think when we sort of work on campaigns, we hear from the loud people, and we assume that that's what people think, and we assume that that's kind of, you know, that must be representative of the population. And I can tell you from experience, in our political campaigning experience, it's not the case. And it's a lot more nuanced, and probably the right answer is always somewhere in the middle. So, you know, again, I think the value of really doing a poll of your community with some good, well thought out questions is invaluable. And when it comes to making no assumptions, you know, people will say nice things to you, to your face, especially in politics. And they don't always necessarily mean everything they say, or sometimes they're just saying it to appease you, but they may have a different opinion. So again, I think with polling and really random, good polling where you're getting a good sample size of an entire community really gives you a good pulse of what people are really thinking. And it gives you then a story to tell, like what Christina was saying. And so that's sort of really important. And on the, you know, what assumptions do you need to test? Again, feel free to leave comments in the Zoom chat to engage and keep it engaging. But you know, one of the things I like to talk about when it comes to making no assumptions, especially when it comes to stakeholder mapping, is literally making a map of every single important stakeholder in your community, every single councillor, the mayor, you know, the city manager, and some of the, you know, key people that work within the city, the chamber, you name it. Make a map, list a huge list of stakeholders. And then work with your tourism stakeholders within your DMO or whatever community you're working with, and see if you can sort of map out who believes what or who stands where on which issue. It really literally can be that granular. Then don't assume that you're right. I can tell you one thing I've learned from political experience is that when you go in with an opinion, people often don't share. And so one thing I've learned through politics is go in asking questions. Don't assume that you know and that somebody will be supportive of your position. You're better off asking the questions, getting people to share what they believe, and then taking that back and sort of collecting the information and then going from there.
Yeah, I think if you're an operator too that's on the call, so I know some of you from Quaid Lodge are on the line, you know, think about it the same way. So you might not be a DMO, but who are the stakeholders in your region that you want to tell your story to ensure they know how important you are and what you bring in. And again, like Peter said, you may put all these people down on a list and say, oh yeah, well the DMO knows how important I am. And you know, this person knows how important I am, but go and have those conversations and make sure that, you know, you are assuming correct. I think too, in terms of, you know, facilitating a roundtable, sometimes it's not evident in terms of, you know, what could I facilitate it around? Could I, you know, do it broadly about tourism in our community? Right now, there's a really interesting opportunity for you to facilitate some roundtables in your community around how businesses are effective. What's the relaunch strategy? Imagine setting up your Zoom roundtable with all of those key stakeholders that you've just listed off as people that are important to you, and having that Zoom call and leading it on, okay, how are we all going to approach relaunch together? And, you know, it could be a really productive call, and you get things down. It could be more just everyone starting to share their opinions and where they're at, but it's positioning you as a valuable leader in the community.
And I think the most important kind of takeaway from this is it's a listening exercise before it's a talking exercise. And I just want to share one quick story, because this is, I know Christina just goes crazy when I just keep talking, but anyways, I will continue. But I was part of so we do work also in the cannabis space, and I was part of a series of roundtables that the Alberta Gaming and Liquor Commission did early on in the cannabis industry's formation in Alberta. And I remember one particular session where it was all sort of people that were, I'd say, pro-cannabis industry, all brought together by the AGLC to talk about certain regulations and certain rules and everything else. And you know, everybody was very passionate about, you know, getting this industry going and opening things up and blah, blah, blah. And I remember the head of the AGLC sort of saying, you know, it's really interesting to listen to this group of people. We brought you all together because we knew you were all sort of, you know, part of the stakeholder group that supported this, and we got a lot of good, valuable information out of this. However, be aware of the fact that there's an entire group of people who are on the exact opposite side of the spectrum from where you sit, and they don't believe the same things that you believe. And I thought it was just so brilliantly done. And the point I'm making is that if you're going to facilitate a number of roundtables and you make some assumptions about people who might be on your side, it might be helpful to bring people together that have a certain view to the extent that it's possible, and maybe some people together that have a certain different view to the extent that it's possible. But what that will do is allow you to go deep into the views of each particular group without actually having sort of them fighting against each other at your round table. So just a little tip there.
Yeah. So you're still listening, and now you're kind of going internally and trying to understand what your why is. So, you know, you typically don't go into a political campaign or an advocacy campaign without knowing what the end goal is. So Peter mentioned this before, is it funding related? So initially Tourism Kamloops was looking to raise the MRDT from 2 to 3%. Is it funding in terms of what government's giving you currently? Is it membership? Are you trying to drive a new model? And I think a lot of you are exploring that at this time, or is it your current model and you're looking to expand upon that or understand sentiment? Is it about increasing regional visitors? I laugh at this because I didn't even remember this was in here, but you know, this is probably a good why for all of us right now. I think that's going to be pretty important in this world. And locals are your best way to start increasing that regional visitation. I think about Peter and I, we just took a trip to the Badlands with the kids this weekend because we knew that provincial park was open and safe and ready for us. Is your why around empowering your locals? I think that through some of that polling, if you don't know if locals are telling your story, ask the question, are they? And start to unpack that a little more. Are you looking towards destination development? You're looking for potential funding partners there, including government. Explore all of these. Why is local advocacy important to you? It could be one or two. It could be all of them, but be realistic there. What are you really trying to achieve? At the end of a local advocacy campaign, so thinking of Tourism Kamloops, at the end of 2019, you know, the goals were really around empowering locals to tell a story and increasing that regional visitation. They could check the box on that, right? So really understanding why you're doing what you're doing is important. I'll let you on that.
No, all I'll add is that I'll always add that the tighter you are on what your why is, I think the more successful your campaign is going to be, and I think the tighter your focus is going to be, the more you're going to achieve what you set out to achieve.
Yeah, so it's not, an easy way to think about this. It's not just, oh, we need a local advocacy campaign, but we need a local advocacy campaign because we want to make sure that we can develop our destination more. We need a local advocacy campaign because we want to move towards a different funding model, right? So what is that because, and what's driving you towards local advocacy? For some of you kind of larger regional DMOs, maybe it's to be able to get your smaller DMOs all aligned, which I think is definitely plausible and important. Maybe it's to, if you're an operator that's on the call, what's your why? Maybe it is to increase that regional traffic to the destination, right? That be a tourist in your own town kind of feel.
And I would suggest your why right now probably has a little bit to do with really deeply understanding what your locals believe about tourism in the COVID world. Yeah. We've heard and talked to many DMOs in the last couple months. And it seems to be a very, very mixed bag out there. And I think a really nuanced understanding and nuanced messaging is critical now more than ever.
I'm dying for someone to do polling on this. So if you've done any real polling, say this is one of these squeaky wheels. My gut tells me that there's a few squeaky wheels here, and there's probably a bunch of people that, like me with little kids who want to get out of the house. But if you're doing polling on it, tell me, because I am so curious to see what those numbers look like.
And if you need polling, let us know. We can help you out with that.
Sales pitch. Your third most important piece is starting to get political. So Peter touched on this in the last one when he talked about list building. But when you start a political campaign, so if you're going to run for office, and when Peter and I used to run campaigns together, we used to say, someone would come to us and say, I'm going to run for government. And we would say, okay, good for you. We want you to make a list of all the people that you know in the community that you're going to run in. And for some people, they would, we'd give them a week and they'd come back and scratch their heads and there'd be a list of, 25 people. And we'd say, you shouldn't run for government. But then you'd have people that you knew, they'd have lists of hundreds of names. And they said, well, I didn't know enough. So I went and knocked on some doors this weekend. Right. So again, who do you know? Who do you know already supports you? Just like in politics, it's about identifying low-hanging fruit. Who do you know, right? If you're a DMO, hopefully your low-hanging fruit are a lot of your operators and the ones that have been really loud and proud about you. But start thinking about, okay, who are these people and who do I need to reach out to? The second piece of getting political is looking at timelines and starting to understand those timelines. So with Tourism Kamloops, the easiest timeline was knowing when that MRDT vote was coming and when those deadlines around that increase was. Another important timeline became the municipal election for them. So ensuring that they were talking to people that were running, ensuring that they were getting some really great questions into forums. So understanding the timeline around, okay, I need this destination developed by this point. I think what the relaunch plans do for us now is create some really great short-term timelines for everyone. We know tentatively some opening dates for things, so you know where you need to be building towards. We also know long-term potentially, okay, in a year or 2 years from now, the international traveler is going to be really important. We know in the next 6 months to a year, that's going to be about a larger regional traveler. So you can start to put timelines towards that.
I will say about getting political, though, is actually this is sort of where are you starting from? What are the variables? A couple of things I'll say about getting political is number one, there are your supporters who are definitely the people you want to arm with great information and turn into your little army. There are the people who are neutral, who are the people who are what in politics we call the accessible voter. And then there are people who are against you. And generally speaking in politics, you want to spend the most effort on the first two groups and the least or no effort on the last group. If you set out to go and convince people who are dead set against you, you're going to be using a lot of your energy and a lot of your effort, and you're not going to get a great outcome. So just keep in mind, really, it's about moving those people who are in the middle or the neutral people into champions. That's how you grow and build your community of champions. It's not to say you ignore the people who are against you. It's just that you're probably not going to convince them. And so they're just not really the best use of your time in terms of your limited resources.
Your goal in building champions is making the champions louder,
Yes.
right? So, you know, eventually when, you know, it's like, who wants chocolate ice cream? And you're the only one that wants strawberry. But if 25 people in the room have already said they want chocolate, you know, you're probably going to just eat chocolate that day, right? So it's the same kind of example in terms of, you know, if that naysayer is seen everywhere that tourism is so important, it makes it more difficult for them to have that venue to speak up negatively against it. When you're thinking about getting political, do a fun exercise. I feel like probably not many of us have looked ahead 3 years and 5 years, especially given what the last couple months has looked like. But start doing some dreaming again. That's going to help you build out your timelines, right? When are those next elections? When potentially do you need to have some buy-in around destination development, around potential funding models? And then that next year, I think a lot of your whys are going to be, you know, how comfortable are my locals in terms of turning this back on in terms of industry? I think too, as you start to think about that year question, it's about comfort, but it's also about, you know, how willing are my locals to experience their city as a local? What are their plans? And starting to explore that. Our fourth one is, now that we've told you to dream, we're going to say, okay, come back down to earth and be realistic. So, you know, what is the budget? And I think a lot of you are dealing with some big question marks in budget right now. What are your unknowns? What are the things you can do that are in-house, potentially on a shoestring budget? What are the things that you should invest in as you're building this out? And how can you resource? I think what's interesting about a time like this is probably you might have a couple more internal resources kicking around that aren't busy doing other things right now, which is interesting.
So obviously, with being realistic, you can't do it all. I think this is where a lot of organizations and frankly, a lot of political campaigns fail, try to be everything to everyone. And so this being realistic slide really ties into what is your why slide, right? So if your why is figuring out a funding model and getting your stakeholders to sort of become champions of a new funding model for your destination, you know, that becomes your priority. And then again, your whole focus then becomes on that, and you let the other things kind of go for a little bit. I think it's really critical to create then really an end goal and an end post, and then really stick to that plan and see it through. So, you know, obviously things like COVID change a lot of things, but there are some things that continue to be important no matter what, COVID or not. I think COVID just, you know, sort of challenges us on the financing side, and on maybe some assumptions that we made before about having local support for tourism. But other than that, I mean, destination marketing and destination management will always be there. Tourism, I think, will always be a critical industry for Canada. And so those things will never change, despite what's going on. So just, you know, really stick to your plan, stay committed, and that's your best approach to seeing it succeed in the long term.
Totally. All right. So it's step 5, and now you're just building your strategy. So I want to, you know, cause some attention to that, right? You're doing a lot of listening, you're doing some polling, you're starting to build lists and really become part of the community. And now you can say, okay, my community needs some education. And I think especially right now, the community is going to want some education around what does it mean when tourism opens up? What does it mean when relaunch is happening? And either it's part 2 of your strategy, or if you're in a very astute town and you've already done some value of tourism work already, maybe you're already at that engagement phase. So as we think about this,
and I'm actually going to just interrupt for 1 second.
Of course you are.
Because that's what I do, everybody. When it comes to, sorry, can you just back up a slide?
Of course.
When it comes to the education piece, and this is sort of something it's almost a question for folks, but I had this conversation with somebody who's probably on the line. I can't see everybody on the line at the moment, but this particular tourism related business said, yeah, we're opening up to locals. And my first question is, well, who are locals? And that turned into a conversation, and that turned into, well, I mean, locals for us is a 12-hour drive from where we are. Well, is that consistent with what people in your local community think a local is? Is there a need to talk about, from an education standpoint, what a local is in the tourism space today more than now than ever? And so I just wanted to mention that, because I think with the COVID situation, sort of a lot of those assumptions that were made in the past are just blown out of the water now. And so really there's an education needed around what some of these things even mean and who some of these people are before you can get to an engagement. Sorry, Christina.
Don't worry, don't be sorry. I mean, exactly, from a components of education, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that that becomes really relevant now. If you're thinking about kind of broader, it's, those economic numbers, people don't understand that. And what I love to say is boil it down into things, right? Because when you start saying, we contribute $20 million to this, or we contribute $2 million to our local economy, what does that mean? How many jobs is that? How many, we used to do this great graphic when I was at CAP, where we do the economic impact of oil and gas in the community. And I would have, 100 schools, right? Little infographic of all these schools, like we help build these because of that economic impact into communities. So think about these really visual ways that you can start to educate. And how this whole engagement piece, so you're educating, you're getting through that piece, lay the foundation. You can't tell people something is valuable and that they should believe in something if they don't know about it yet. So don't assume that everyone knows value of tourism. Start at a place of, we're going to educate you about tourism, who it's affecting. Did you know your neighbor is in the tourism industry? I think it's always surprising for even our family. As COVID hit, they went, oh, well, you guys aren't affected at all. You're a communications and marketing firm. And we said, well, half of our business is in the tourism space. And everyone went, oh, right. So understanding those, what is the big picture of what your industry actually represents and who it affects is so key to that education campaign.
Yeah. And a couple comments on this, and this is a very political campaign, but our political thing I'm going to say, but Ed Stelmach, who was a premier I liked a lot, actually was a very visionary premier, had a lot of great ideas, wasn't very strong at articulating why. And really educating people as to sort of getting a baseline of education as to why a direction was going in. And that sort of drove me crazy about it. I'm sorry to be so political, but my point is that, you need to, before you start articulating a solution or sort of telling people that things that should be, you really need to sort of take a step back and really make sure there's a baseline of understanding and a why, and get people's buy-in as to the why, and why tourism is important first. Second thing I'll say on this slide, just relative to something Christina said, is that I think with just how much money is being spent, billions here and millions there and whatever, that when you start to see big numbers, people's eyes almost glaze over now. So I think to what Christina was saying before, make it as relevant to people in their own backyard as possible. And I think the more relevant you can make it to, your neighbor's job and the farmer's, the farmer supplies this, and really local and really relevant to people from a local community perspective, resonates a lot more than, we have $72 million of economic advantage. I just think people are glazing over with big numbers.
Tourism Richmond did a really awesome job at this. I think it was 3 or 4 years back, where they talked about the blueberry farmer. Hands up if you've seen this video, but right, it showed the blueberry farmer and then his blueberries supplying the restaurant, but his blueberries supplying the blueberry jam. It was right, like it just became this whole big building on top of each other. Or there was another video, I forget what destination it was, but they did the woman sitting at the cafe, so the tourist sitting at the cafe, and the milk was from the local dairy farm, and the chair was made by the local craftsman, and the business, right, like it just built on each other, and it was this really powerful visual. I remember sitting at a conference, and they just had the images kind of pop up in front of each other. So those are those powerful education pieces. And then really, as you're thinking about strategy and you get into the engagement part, it's how can you engage in new ways? And what types of engagement will your community be receptive to? If your community is one that isn't on social media a lot, right? Think you're engaging locals now. You're not engaging potential tourists. So as potential tourists, we're probably on social looking for things lots. But where do your stakeholders hang out? For Kamloops, it was this really, like, Twitter and LinkedIn became really important tools for telling this story. So did going to coffee chats. So did a lot of in-person speaking. So you got to really turn engagement on its head. What are the ways that you're going to actually get in front of locals? Where do locals hang out? Are there big events that you can potentially go to and talk to them in a different way than you would have been approaching tourists at that same event? Which is a great segue to step number 6, which is your tactics, right? So I want you to be present in the community. I want it to be about paying it forward and thinking outside the box. You know, thinking about, went too soon. Thinking about, like I said, where your locals are hanging out, but how can you leverage some of those other relationships that have already come to the table, right? So like think about chambers and all the socials they have. Is there a way now for you to be part of that and be a speaker, right? So can you build this really powerful value of tourism-based PowerPoint presentation that you then take on your little local roadshow to your Rotary clubs, to your chambers, to your government officials, to your media, and say, hey, like, look at all these great stats and information. And then what's the call to action? We want locals to take this pledge. We want locals to visit 3 or 4 different places. I think that, you know, what becomes super important when you think about tactics is do something different. For Kamloops, the bus was really different. We'll see you on that call, Joanne, in a bit. The bus became something really different. The podcast, very different, right? All of these different ways to think outside the box. My favorite was when Angie from Tourism Kamloops told me that her parents-in-law were listening to the podcast, but they listened to it on the radio every Saturday morning and they loved it. They would tune in at 8 o'clock. They always turned it on, and it was like, here are 2 people that never got involved in tourism, even though their daughter-in-law was in part of Tourism Kamloops. It didn't, okay, that's her job, but these real life stories is what really captured them, and they became involved in the program that way. Really, that's the end of the presentation, but I feel like it ends with this, like, hey, the world is your oyster, right? Like all of these different examples and tactics, and that's the fun part to talk about. So, I mean, I encourage you guys, that's why it's step 6. Do the hard work in terms of 1 to 5 first before you get into, you know, let's do this special thing or that special thing. You get grounded first.
Perfect. So if anybody wants to talk about our approach to building a local advocacy program, we are offering a free 30-minute consultation. Christina is going to share this Calendly link. Maybe she's not going to share this Calendly link.
I am. I'm just going to stop sharing first.
If not, there will be a follow-up email that goes out after this presentation with a recording of most of the presentation, and then my Calendly link will be on there. So we'd love to talk to you about what you're thinking, your plans. There's no obligation to anybody. Just sort of, you know, brainstorming session. We can sort of chat about what you're thinking, and we can go from there.
Yeah, so I threw the Calendly link in the chat. Feel free to book 30 minutes with Peter on a video call, and I'll be there too. But I find as you're at this phase, it's so nice to just have someone to ask you some critical questions. So Peter and I are always happy to do that for you so that you can get grounded. I know that Peter is going to jump off onto that task force call, but I know that there's a bunch of folks on the line. So I'm happy to do a bit of a Q&A if you guys have some specific questions around building advocates. Now that I can see the participant list again, Julie from BC Wildlife Park, I think there's some really interesting things for you here in terms of understanding your supporters, understanding how you could engage your community even further. There's cool education pieces there. Oh, hi, Brian. I'm talking to you shortly, but I feel like this piece and the things that we'll start learning through the campaign kits will be really valuable, can help you guys kind of build this program out further. Yeah, does anyone else have any big questions that they want to ask? Anything that comes to mind? It's a lot to take in, I feel like. I'll let you guys see for a minute. Michelle, anything you want to add from a Tourism Kamloops perspective too, feel free.
All right, folks, thanks for your time. I'm going to jump out. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Cool. Well, you guys all have Peter's link, and you guys have, most of you have my email, Christina@CIPRcommunications.com. I'm always happy to talk about this piece, but like I said, in this relaunch world, I think that it's never been more relevant to start understanding who your supporters are and your advocates, especially as we think about tourism changing, you know, in the immediate future from this kind of larger play to something that's more localized, and people in your community understanding how important that is and how many jobs and individuals it can affect is really, really key and really important. But thank you guys. Appreciate you joining us today. I'm sure we'll talk to a lot of you again soon. Again, link in the chat just below this. And I look forward to chatting with a bunch of you. But have an awesome rest of the week. Remember, next week, we have a great session around coaching. It's actually with our business coach, Steve Osman, who has coached us through many different things. So a nice value add for you guys if you're thinking about what's next for me and my business. And yeah, it's interesting. Cool. Thanks, Michelle. Looking forward to connecting with you. Have a great day, everyone.